everyone, and firstly I want to say how lovely it is to actually see people. Like most of you, it's been boxes for the last 2 and a bit years, so this is very nice. As already you know, I'm Camilla Fleetcroft, and I have just joined the team at Eclavar about a month ago as their VP for Clinical and Regulatory Affairs. Prior to that, I joined the MHRA about 9 years ago, starting as a clinical advisor for their medical device team. And then in 2018, I took on the head of clinical investigations and evaluation at the MHRA. And then more recently, I took on Graham Tunbridge's old role of Devices Regulatory Group Manager, which subsequently transformed into Deputy Director for Innovative Devices. So it's been busy. The last 2.5 years been very busy. My responsibilities were leading some of the agency's response to the pandemic, particularly in testing and PPE. But also, I was the operational lead for designing and developing the consultation to the new regulatory framework. So go gentle on me on the questions, please. So today I've been asked to put my regulator hat back on, very briefly, and talk about clinical investigations and evaluations from the perspective of a competent authority. I just want to caveat, the UK is a slightly unique competent authority, obviously, after our EU exit. So this is just my perspective as part of the UK competent authority. Other competent authorities may indeed have divergent opinions and challenges. However, I hope you'll find this session very interesting. So, I thought I'd start with a bit of context on how on earth have we ended up where we are. So, early 90s, as we all know, we had the arrival of the 3 directives. At the time, this was obviously very groundbreaking, a very new way of approaching medical device regulation, much needed and much welcomed very much at the time. But as all of us, we age. I've certainly got a bit more clunky as I've got older, and as did the directives. We just know that they weren't agile enough, they weren't extensive enough to deal with those challenges, not only of a changing Europe, the bigger Europe it got, the more challenging it was, more competent authorities on board, but also the evolution of medtech and IVDs. The pace at which this sector moves is almost unimaginable, and I think the innovation unrivaled personally across any other sector. I think it's miraculous. And I don't think at the time of the creation of the directives, anyone could have truly predicted where we are now in 2022 with the devices we have. Not just software and AI, but the pace at which the more run-of-the-mill business as usual devices, how they change on a daily, almost daily basis. The final global driver that we saw, of course, was those high-profile incidents, your PIP breast implants, your metal-on-metal hips, and also your vaginal mesh controversies. They all raised very appropriate questions. Are the regulations doing a good enough job? Should they be better? And so with all that to contend with, after a few discussions and a great deal of years, we ended up in 2017 with the EU MDR and IVDR. And I think for the most part, quite welcome for the shift, but we'll come on to the challenges in a moment. The UK has its additional drivers, as you'll all know. So we have EU exit, a big political driver, and the decision subsequently not for us to implement the MDR and the IVDR. The second big driver for us was in 2020, the publication of the Independent Medicines and Medical Device Safety Review by Baroness Cumberledge. So from a device perspective, there was one device in the review, and that was the vaginal mesh. And we know that she looked very hard. She spoke to a lot of patients. She spoke to us as the regulator to find out what went wrong. So not only from a regulatory perspective, but also how the UK healthcare system dealt with it. Did they respond accordingly? And ultimately, she felt how we failed the UK patients. It was tough reading. In the review, recommendation 6 particularly says you need an urgent review of the medical device legislation. So with that in mind, we were already reviewing it, but we certainly took forward her comments. And the real driver there is, okay, we've got almost a clean slate. What do we do that's right for the UK and the UK patients, whilst equally cementing the MHRA's position on that global scale? So, putting the focus a bit more now on to clinical investigations and evaluation. With the MDR in place, what did that really mean for us all? So, first of all, it meant more evidence at the point of CE marking, being the point of it being granted, you've got more data, it's more robust is the idea, and that effectively boots you along the timeline, it pushes you back along. That's very clear. There's that clear focus on the need for that more pre-market clinical data, but also for those already in the market, reassessing the data you've got. Where are your gaps? What do you need to meet the new standard? So stricter requirements, increased expectations of data, like I said, but also the requirements in monitoring the sector. What are the actions we have to take? The regulator particularly has seen more on the to-do list. The documentation required, the clarity, the transparency. Increased scrutiny. You've got your data, but what's it going to go through? It's going to go through more of a rigorous process. It's going to be checked more. No more free passes, as someone once said to me. And finally, improved transparency, obviously for the EU, predominantly through the MEDDEV system, and the UK equally looking to transparency within its own domestic system. So in general, I think it's fair to say the EU MDR and IVDR set out to increase the quality of the standard of those devices coming to market and increase the responsibility of the sector around it to make sure that that was being upheld. So, apologies. So, you all know this. It was very much adopted in MEDDEV 271 Revision 4 as sort of the ethos of how we do this. So it's your critical assessment of the relevant scientific literature, it's your analysis of your clinical trial data, and indeed basing this against that background of what else is there, what's the state of the art, what other options are there instead of your product. So, like I've already mentioned, there's a huge shift to the right of the timeline, and this was certainly something that was raised very early on when the new rules came out. So we know roughly what that means for industry, but what does that mean for your competent authorities? So from the MHRA perspective, that sudden focus on that pre-market data inevitably meant more clinical trials to come through, more assessments to do. You also had your focus on post-market, very proactive post-market surveillance, requiring oversight from a competent authority. There's also a particular example in the clinical investigation site inspections, something very new for competent authorities across the board. Questions initially at the MHRA was, how do we do that? It's not something devices had done before. Who does it? What's the training need? What's the resource required? And indeed, what's the cost impact, not only to industry, but to the competent authority themselves? So at the base of all this, the key fact for me was that regulators and industry suddenly had to rethink how they work. These new rules are lovely, but they didn't fit into our old mode of action. They didn't fit into how we worked already. We do need to generate good data. We do need to ensure devices come to market in a timely manner, but not at the cost of safety and performance. So the million-dollar question, is this all worth it? Does this really fundamentally change anything? Has it increased the requirements? Does it answer those challenges I had on the first slide, the issues we saw of the past? The short answer is yes, I think these principles do go a long way to answer the challenges of the past and the errors of the past. However, it's not just the rules or the legislation we put in place. This is really about to realize those improvements, to have excellent devices, safe devices on our market, we need a system response and implementation. A cultural shift, if you will. Regulators, industry, notified and approved bodies, healthcare systems, researchers, all working together to make that system work and to make these come to fruition. A question I am regularly asked is, would this stop metal on metal hip? Would these rules stop another vaginal mesh controversy? There is no black or white response to this. I don't have the magic answer, but I do think it would go a long way to minimizing the risks of those. But I think it's important to say that it doesn't matter what rules we put in place. They could be the most perfect rules. If we can't implement it, if we can't make them achievable, then they don't work. And I think that's the flip side of this coin. But in theory, yes, I think they would prevent those issues. But I think what we're seeing is huge challenges in implementing them to actually make that come true. And I think it's very apparent, pop on LinkedIn, online forums, that competent authorities and industry alike have real concerns. They have real challenges, and we're not seeing the smooth implementation I think we would all have hoped back in 2017 in getting these standards increased. I would just add, someone once said to me, well, let's just extend the transition period. Transition periods are one thing. They're a useful tool. They help take the burden off and alleviate it slightly, but without sound implementation being done within that transition period, you're just delaying the inevitable. You're just delaying that cliff edge and the problems that are going to come through. If those challenges are not addressed and mitigated, then ultimately we risk supply. And if we risk supply, whether it be through delay to coming through market to get your CE mark or your UKCA mark, or indeed industry, as some have said, no, I'm done, I'm not going to put my device on your market, then ultimately it's the patient and the public at the end of the day that are suffering again. So we're not solving anything, we're creating difficulties in other ways. And that is just detrimental to our system. We also must remember, as I said at the beginning, the pace of the sector is still there. The challenges will continue to rise. We will continue to see new devices that challenge the rules put in place. So, and that's global. Doesn't matter what country that in. The FDA will see it, the EU will see it. But I think what's important to know is that what we need is rules that are agile. They can deal with the challenges, they can respond to the challenges, and that's certainly something we're trying to be mindful of in the UK. So, the key challenges for the regulator. I don't think it will surprise you that resource is at the top of the list. Globally, we see a resource issue. That is nothing special to the EU or the UK. Increased competent authority involvement, increased checkpoints with the competent authority naturally means more on their to-do list. It means they have more processes to put in place, more people to do the reviews. For example, more clinical investigations, reviews, inspections like I already touched on. And this is just one part of the regulation. If you think about the extent of the MDR and the IVDR, the number of touch points, it does dramatically increase. So implementing the new regs has been a huge undertaking, and the UK for the most part was part of the initial implementation of the MDR. So the EU level discussions, particularly from our perspective, we were involved in sufficient clinical data and equivalence discussions. They caused much debate and many inconsistencies in those discussions. National implementation, cross-system implementation, for example, competent authorities working with their healthcare ethics committees, their research authorities, and partnering up with those key people to make it as smooth a process as possible. It's not a quick win, it's not overnight. Competent authorities are having to work very hard to build that infrastructure. Of course, they want to uphold the higher standards, but like I said before, it's got to be operational, it's got to be manageable. We can't sit there on our high platform and say you must meet this if it's just not achievable. So there's also considerations on where you can take that pragmatic approach. Where can you smooth those processes for for example, in clinical investigations, the applicants? It's important that we don't create inconsistencies, particularly on the EU platform. We don't want to create new shortcuts. We don't want to create new loopholes. We need to learn those lessons from the past, but like I said, it needs to be operational. Unfortunately, that is not a question I can fully answer. The UK lost its influence and seat around the table a few years ago now. But from our perspective, it has been a huge challenge and a huge undertaking to try and increase the standards, but not create new loopholes. So capability is another key challenge for competent authorities. How do we continue to review these applications? How do we find the expertise we need? The MHRA currently has an incredibly gold standard process. We often go to external clinical experts for our reviews, as well as our internal regulatory reviews. But with the innovation, the divergence of devices, where do we find these people? Where do we find these new experts? They're often very small in number, often have very little interest in helping a competent authority do any reviews. So this all adds limitations to what we can do. So that comes back again to the ways of working. How does a competent authority in the face of this ever-increasing sector do the best it can? The EU, I will add, has a very interesting resource in the expert panels, but again, as you all know, that's got its own logistical limitations as they progress them. And linked to all these points, and I won't touch on it too long because I know there are other sessions on it, is the addition of Annex 16. Massively increase the scope of the regulation, means increased regulatory load, but it also brings a whole bunch of new questions. Is how do you assess the benefit? What is the benefit? Who are the experts? How do we regulate Annex 16 in real world terms when it comes to clinical investigations and evaluation? It's a whole new door open, and it's certainly a big learning curve for competent authorities. So the UK, where are we now? Currently we are in our standstill period still. That runs until 30th of June 2023. And during this time, you can, of course, put your CE-marked product on the UK market and register it with the MHRA. There was the decision not to implement the MDR and IVDR in the UK, and so as a result, over the last couple of years, the MHRA has conducted an in-depth review and consultation process on its own domestic legislation. That was a slip, wasn't it? They will update it using the powers of the Medicines and Medical Devices Act that came into force in 2021. So I mentioned earlier the UK is quite unique, and only last week someone asked me why on earth the UK follows the directives. Why is it still on the old clunky system when there's a new shinier one to be had? The reality is that is really a legal situation. Had the MDR come into force in May 2020, it would automatically applied in the UK. Because of the delay, it shifted it outside of that transition period from our exit. So it gave the government the chance to make the decision themselves. So unfortunately, from my perspective, it didn't get adopted. We had done a lot of work to implement it, so it was sadly a bit of a shame from my perspective. Northern Ireland adds an additional level of political legal challenge in that as part of the EU exit, the Northern Ireland Protocol was agreed. And this means Northern Ireland is part of the single market still, and as such follows EU regulations. So it has adopted the EU MDR automatically last year, and just last month, the IVDR. So we are very much the regulator of two halves. Which brings very much its own challenges. So, as I said, with competent authority for Great Britain, which is Scotland, Wales and England, and also Northern Ireland, but under different hats, as it were. So we have to operate both regulations. That is not without its difficulties, unfortunately. One area that this is particularly apparent in is clinical investigations. We technically have to be able to review a clinical investigation under the directives, under the UK MDR, and under the EU MDR, and soon the IVDR. The operational challenges there are technically, they should be confidential from each other. We should have a wall between our assessors. So that's jurisdiction confidentiality. We have different timescales under the different regulations. We have the potential for expert panel input, and indeed there's also that future question around coordinated assessments. Now, I can't predict the future. We know the Northern Ireland Protocol is being challenged at the moment, and we do wait to see what implications that has. But ultimately, if the Northern Ireland Protocol is still in effect in 6 years' time, Northern Ireland may have to do coordinated assessments. How does the MHRA do that? Future challenges to bear in mind, but a bit of a watch this space at the moment. So what have we seen practically? Well, despite all of this, actually the issue profile for clinical investigation applications hasn't really changed. So the question I suppose here is, has it improved stuff then? I think it's probably too early to tell. We have only seen a handful of Northern Ireland trials come through, but so far I would say that the new regulations perhaps haven't changed the same issues that researchers and industry have in designing their studies. So the common issues very much continue to be inappropriate data or lacking of data of biological safety, lack of information or rationale for sterilisation processes, Critically, a massive lack in data on clinical and technical effectiveness of the device, even from bench testing perspective. Software trials we often see coming without their basic testing data, which is, seems a bit ludicrous to me, but hey-ho. And I think rather critically, and it's not the bottom of the list by any means, is genuinely poor study design. There's a lot of attempts just to rush through, put it through quickly, and often we see designs that are just inappropriate for the device. They're not looking after the participants well enough, they're not mitigating that risk, or indeed even assessing what those risks are. And that has continued. We haven't seen much shift in that profile of issues, as I said. However, it doesn't matter what regulation they're under, these issues still need to continue to be addressed, and I think competent authorities need to find a way to support people. How do you make these things better? And that comes through guidance from competent authorities, but also from researchers and industry seeking other support. So there are solutions, and like I said, they are not reliant on whatever regulation you're doing, they are just a very general approach. For industry, the first and most impactful solution is if you are struggling, you don't really know what you're looking for, then ask an expert. Get your sound design. Now, a competent authority cannot consult you on that, but a CRO can. Ask the experts. And certainly at my time at MHRA, we did send a few people off to find themselves a CRO. So the other thing is really important is, like I said, give us the data. When you apply to a competent authority, don't just do a quick job of uploading a few documents here and there. You saw some of the issues were just due to the data not being there. And more often than not, the applicant had the data. They just hadn't given it to us. It adds time, it adds resource, it delays the whole process. So be upfront, give everything you've got, and it should make the process run a bit better. My final point for industry is it's so important, and particularly now, is think beyond conformity assessment. Don't just be focused on getting your CE mark or your UKCA mark. Think beyond that. What we've seen at the MHRA is often there is a very low level of understanding of the regulations of how you get your device from concept through to market and beyond. Your responsibility doesn't stop there. So your clinical evaluation is life cycle of your device. So plan that from the beginning as best you can. And again, seek the experts if you need it. Don't just try and fudge it. If you're not sure, ask. That's my advice. So the competent authority, they also have some solutions at hand. And to my mind, they are reducing duplication, making the processes a bit easier. They're a bit old and they're a bit clunky, certainly in the UK. And that's not just from the burden of the application itself and the review process, but it's technical things like IT systems that make the process easier for everyone. You know, really quick wins in my mind. Make it user-friendly, and certainly the MHRA before I left, making great moves to try and implement better processes and better systems. We piloted, my team piloted a combined assessment with the HRA in the UK, so the Ethical Committee, and that was really well received. They've done it for the medicines trials as well. And as a result of that, we've now looked internally. How can you do a combined assessment within the MHRA for combined products, looking at the realities, the real-world implementation of CTR versus the Medical Device Regulation. And again, really well received, and working really well for the applicants, so getting that one response for your research. And finally, looking to the global picture. So we get asked a lot, when will a global form be ready? You know, when can I use all my global data for all of the jurisdictions? Personally, I think we're a way off yet. I think there's a lot to do. There's a lot of challenges in getting jurisdictions to find that common ground. I do think it's an exciting and real-world solution to some of the research questions that we have. And I think it would really help with a lot of the resource burden and the sort of duplication burden that we see to have that global approach. And of course, it's a real step on that global harmonisation pathway that we hope to continue. So beyond 2023, like I said, standstill ends next June. And I think the probing question I suspect some of you will ask is, what's next for the MHRA? Well, we patiently await the publication of their response to the consultation. And I think there are some really key questions that we do need answered, and that is, what are the timelines? What is being put in place? Is there any alignment to other jurisdictions? Is there divergence? If so, what is the real impact of those divergences? And what is the impact on the sector? Not just industry, not just researchers, but the competent authority at the MHRA. So I think crucially, what are the next steps? Some of you may be aware they have committed to running focus groups, and the idea of those focus groups is guidance generation and discussion around implementation. How do they make it work for you and them at the same time? And I do hope the publication will go a long way to answer some of those questions. MHRA, as long as I've worked there, and I hope it continues to be, has been known as quite a pragmatic regulator. And I fully anticipate they will continue to do so as they move into their new framework. And we know that they've joined the IMDRF, they're official observers of MDSAP, and we hope that that continues as well, that driving international voice. So the global solution is an important one, and as I mentioned, a key solution is to seek an expert, and ECLVAR can be that expert for you. If you'd like to hear more about MHRA life, regulations, then please do come and chat to us. If you think we can support you with your research, whether pre-market or post-market, then please come and chat to us. We've got an incredible team, competent authority, notified body, industry, and CRO expertise. Just one of my final slides is, these are the current areas we cover. Please come and chat to us if you think you can help. We're a lovely team, friendly bunch, and we'd be really happy to talk through your solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Camila. I think you touched on a lot of the difficulties of having higher regulations, higher scrutiny for the regulations. You know, we're here for the patient, but sometimes in that implementation, there are challenges to meet the higher burden. So I guess I'd like to ask, you know, because the UK has been such a driver of the MDR and implementation, those guidances, I believe your bio said that you participated on the MDC 2020-5. Will the UK, even though they're not currently being regulated to the MDR, do you think that they will benefit from having that expertise in-house, so to speak?
I think they do, and I think the MHRA has always been very open in its fact that because it was so involved in those principles and those discussions, that it certainly wasn't looking to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And it certainly, those of you that had the time or the inclination to read the very long consultation document will have seen that there's a lot of synergies with the EU, a lot of questions around, is that the right thing to do for the UK? So I'm afraid only time will tell on what they take forward. But certainly they didn't dismiss it. You know, it would have been foolish to. We were until recent times an EU country. Our systems are built on the EU regulations. So it would have been personally, and this is personal, anyone who's watching from MHRA, I think it would have been crippling to completely ignore it. So that's why the consultation came out with the tone that it did, of quite EU basic underneath, but what might we do further for the UK?
Wonderful, thank you. We have a few minutes left for questions. Is there any questions from the audience? I see one in the back.
Hello, Alison Dennis Taylor Wessing. You had on one of your slides over-regulation, question mark.
Yeah.
The question is, discuss.
Yeah, that's a more of a thought-provoking question, is have they gone too far? If you can't implement these rules, have you over-regulated? So there is always a discussion, and it's certainly one we've had at the UK, of what do you put into law and mandate versus what do you put in good, clear guidance. And I think that's a debate that runs across all jurisdictions. I think it's a really valid one. I personally prefer slightly less law and better guidance. I think it gives regulations better time to flex, but I do also I do understand the pressures of the challenges I set out of being seen to do more in law to protect patients. And I completely stand by that. But I think it's a really fine balance between the two. So the question is, has it just gone that bit too far? If we can't implement it, is it actually failing rather than improving things?
Gentleman up front.
I have two. First one, you mentioned synergy and global harmonization and working with others to find a solution. Does the regulators in the UK, EU, FDA, you guys work together to understand from each other and work on the solutions for approving the submissions?
So not directly in CIs, in clinical investigation applications. And a lot of that comes down to the confidentiality issues that I flagged as a challenge between regulators. Is you obviously then need to seek permission from the applicant to discuss the EU. I don't think there'd be huge sort of hatred of the idea. I think a lot of applicants would find it beneficial. But what we did do at MHRA is we set up a call, very late night call between Australia, FDA, Health Canada and ourselves, not to discuss specific applications, but to discuss the themes we were seeing in our applications and the challenges we were seeing in the clinical investigation space. So those discussions do happen, but they're not specific. But you do try, they certainly were trying to piece together what the global picture looks like. And I hope that continues. I think global regulation, personally, I think is the way forward. So hopefully those continue to happen.
Last point, thank you very much for that. And you mentioned a couple of challenges regarding the regulatory bodies and the resources. What we are finding in the industry, in the pharma industry for the respiratory products especially, inconsistency, even for the same applicants, similar products, filing them, different people, different team change in the regulatory authorities, and 2 years later we get the guidance and the questions or the CRL. They are different what we have done before. Okay, we can understand learning process throughout but sometimes it's overkill and we don't understand it, that why it is different team gone in and then here we go again.
So you mean inconsistencies within one body?
Yes, please, yes.
Yeah, I think that's probably maybe one inconsistency we will never see the end of. I think it's really difficult. Like you say, there is that learning curve. There's also legal challenges. So more broadly in regulation, if an incident comes up which forces a competent authority into reviewing its processes, and ultimately that challenge is successful, then they have to almost backtrack a little bit or change their direction. So that's one reason you may suddenly get a different opinion. But yes, ultimately it's team change, it's training change, and it's difficult. And I think my suggestion to you would always be just to make sure you have a record of all those decisions that anybody, whether it's a regulator, approved, notified body, makes, so that you have that case. We know regulation changes, we know decisions change, but I think it's only fair that this really does become that partnership between applicant, industry and the competent authorities or the approved notified bodies that they're dealing with, in that you have that dialogue and you have that understanding. For your case, why did that decision change? What is the rationale? It might have been perfectly clear or minimal once explained, but it's hard when you're just being bombarded with the changing answer. So, roundabout way, I don't think that will ever go away. But I think what's really important is that human change, absolutely, but from your side, document it, keep it on file, and challenge them. If they're, absolutely open to challenge. They follow the regulation, obviously, they're the owners of the regulation from a competent authority perspective, but doesn't mean they're always right. We've been wrong at MHRA. Yeah,
I'm writing this down.
There's probably a whole list of people that have published something on where MHRA have changed their mind or have been wrong, but it's about interpretation. So never be afraid to politely challenge your regulator.
No battles between
No battles. It's a partnership. I live in a world where I aim for nice partnerships and collaboration rather than challenge. But yeah, that's right.
All right. I think we're about time.
Yeah.
So Camila, thank you so much.